Good evening, and welcome to our Tanya class, chapter 26. In the edition that we're using, the one with commentary, it's on page 346. And we're in the middle of chapter 26. 26 is the beginning of a new section of the Tanya, devoted to responding to people who had problems with simcha, with joy. People who were suffering from forms of, I wouldn't say clinical depression, but with a down spirit, feeling that something is missing in their lives and they can't get the joy that they know is needed, and which was established at the very beginning of the Tanya, is absolutely crucial to serving God. As it says in the Psalms, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. And the Alter Rebbe, when he wrote the Tanya, wrote it as a book of responses to questions that people had, spiritual questions. And one of the major spiritual impediments is the lack of joy. So in the first part of the chapter that we discussed last week, he was talking about the importance of simcha, of joy. He says, like two wrestlers, it's not important, or it's not as important in terms of winning the wrestling match, who is stronger. What's most important is their attitude. If one is very lazy and sluggish and depressed, he's not going to be able to muster the strength that he has in order to win the wrestling match. So you need simcha, you need joy in order to overcome all the obstacles. And since life is a big challenge, we don't have the luxury of not having this joy in order to win the battles and meet the challenges. But then he said there are times when sadness is appropriate, but only, and he gave certain conditions, at designated times that you're in control of it, and only provided that it's followed immediately by a sense of joy, knowing that you've already dealt with your problem and it's taken care of, and now you can go on serving God and studying Torah with great joy. And he emphasized the importance of joy as it's mentioned in the Torah, as the Arizal interprets it, and that establishes the foundation. And now he's going to go into the problems that some people have and how to deal with it. I was listening to a class by Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, who was a very prominent teacher of Chassidic, and he told the story of Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa. He was a great Chassidic master in Poland. And he was once in a port city, and he was walking alongside the ocean, and from the distance he saw someone struggling with the waves and really having a hard time staying afloat. And he apparently he couldn't get there to save the person, and there was no one else around to save him, but he sees the guy really struggling, and first maybe it seemed that he would make it, and then it looked like all his strength, all his energy was just dissipating, and he was about to go down and give up the struggle. And Rabbi Bunim shouted to him, when you go down, give regards to the Leviathan. Send my warmest regards to the Leviathan. And the guy cracked up laughing, and it gave him the strength, and he was able to get out of the waves, and he was saved. So that was a physical example of how the laughter, the joy, literally rejuvenated him physically, and he was able to save his life. So that's a good metaphor for how simcha gives us strength, and it enables us to overcome all of the obstacles. When the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, I think it was called by some a collection of advice. It was like a modern day advice column, but it was more of spiritual nature. And one of the prayers that we say in our davening 3 times a day, we ask God, Hashiva Shovteinu K'Varishona V'Yotzenu K'Vatchila. Please restore our judges as in the days of old, and our advisors as they were in the beginning. So we're asking God, we need judges. Judges are the people who lay down the law. They're a little bit aloof. Their job is not to be part of the community. Their job is mostly to teach and instruct and judge. But then you have the advisors. Those are the mentors, the people who relate to every individual. And there's no question that the Alter Rebbe was both. He wrote a classic work on Jewish law, the revised version of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and he wrote the Tanya. The Shulchan Aruch is his work of judgment, where he tells the people what's right, what's wrong, and the Tanya is the role. The role that Tanya played was to be the advisor, the kind, the concerned, the empathetic, the inspirational advisor who teaches us how to deal with life's challenges. So with that introduction, we'll start the middle of the chapter on page 346. It's the middle of the page. I'll say it in Hebrew and then read the translation and then do some commentary. Vehine. The word vehine is an introductory word which means and behold, or here it is. So they don't even translate it. Eitza hayutza literally it means the advice that is advisable. That's a common Hebrew expression to repeat words for emphasis. So they translate it as sound advice. Litaher libo, to cleanse his soul, or one's heart rather. Mikol etzev, from all sadness. Benidnu daiga, and any trace of worry. Memili de alma, from mundane matters. Viafilu, and even banai, chaye, umazoni, even with regard to children, health, and livelihood. Okay, so first of all, what does he mean by, he says, sadness and worry? Those are the two major, I think, issues that contemporary people suffer from. Sadness, that's depression, and anxiety. Sadness is about the past, anxiety is about the future. And the one feeds into the other. If you're sad about the past, then you're anxious about the future. If you're anxious about the future, you're usually sad because you feel that you're not going to be able to deal with it, so it causes sadness. And I know psychologists are constantly talking about the interplay between depression and anxiety. They very often go together. And if they're separate, they're both formidable issues that we have to deal with. So we have to deal with getting rid of sadness and getting rid of anxiety, and in what matters. So the Alter Rebbe is going to divide sadness actually into at least three categories. There's sadness for spiritual shortcomings, sadness for sins, in other words. There's sadness for the fact that we're in a constant struggle in our lives, a moral and spiritual struggle, even if we're not guilty of any sins that we're worried about. And then there are the material things that we're concerned about that causes us to be sad, and he's going to tackle that first. Why he's tackling that first, he doesn't explain, but I think it's quite obvious that most people are concerned about material matters before they're concerned about spiritual matters. That's the natural tendency, because after all, we are physical creatures, and we respond well to good things, and we respond not so well to negatives. But there are three areas in which he focuses on that causes the sadness. Now, of course, there are people who are sad because they don't have every luxury in the world. If a person can't afford a luxury car, they could be sad. The Alter Rebbe was not addressing those people. In his days, his Chassidim were not concerned that they only owned two color TVs and they couldn't get the third one, the latest model, or that they didn't have a Maserati, they didn't have this huge mansion. If people had two rooms they were already rich. No one worried about material luxuries in those days. And anyone who worries about it has bigger problems than what we're talking about over here. But the truth is, I'm going to make a 180-degree turnaround. He says people today for whom luxuries causes them depression, they are really people who need to hear the advice over here, because to them the luxury is a necessity, and whatever your necessity is, that's where you are. So if you're a person who can't live without luxuries, you're in big trouble, and that depression has to be addressed. But basically, the things that we really have to focus on are these three things: children, life or health, and sustenance. Those are the three primary areas of concern, because without those three being taken care of, it not only undermines our physical lives, it also undermines our spiritual lives. A person whose family situation is not good, a person whose health is not good, and a person who's impoverished obviously has a difficult time living a Jewishly rich life. The physical has an effect on the spiritual. And even though you can think of some of the people to whom the Rebbe is addressing as being spiritual people, but the Alter Rebbe's mentor and master once said, if there's a small hole in the body, it can create a big hole in the soul. So that physical health is very important, even for the spiritual needs that we have. So if someone doesn't have physical needs, there's a double depression. If you're spiritual, you feel, number one, I'm missing the material things that I need, and number two, I can't practice my Judaism. I can't get up in the morning to pray in the morning because I'm too tired when a person is not well. I can't concentrate on my Torah study because my mind is so preoccupied with where am I going to get my next meal? How am I going to support my family? So we're talking about physical deprivation, but it goes hand in hand with spiritual deprivation. So how do you deal with this? So the Alter Rebbe addresses this issue in several places, and this is the strongest, perhaps, of all the different places where he addresses it. In some places, the Alter Rebbe uses the argument that suffering is sometimes to be seen as having a positive value because it's an atonement. When a person who's lacking in their observance, and everyone knows their own shortcomings, and we wait for Yom Kippur to ask God for forgiveness, we're better off if we had endured some type of pain and suffering, because we know that cleanses us. And again, I have to repeat, I'm going to repeat it over and over again, we never ask for suffering. We never say, God, I have a few sins, and I don't want to wait for Yom Kippur, so give me some pain today. You don't do that. But once the person has the pain, they should look at it as, you know what? If I had some stain on my soul, that will cleanse it. My soul was just sent to the washing machine, and it was cleansed. It was painful. If you go into a washing machine and turn with it in the hot water, it's pretty painful, but it gets the job done. So that's one approach, that suffering is a form of cleansing. It's cathartic. And there are a lot of people who tell you that they went through difficulties in life, and they felt that they were transformed, they were cleansed, they feel more pure. And of course, that can lend itself to distortion, that we should be encouraging suffering and pain and being very insensitive to other people who are suffering and say, well, it's a good thing that you're suffering. No, you never do that. That's evil. To in any way try to make a person feel that they should be that their suffering is okay. We never make peace with another person's suffering, but we're talking about how we could view our own suffering or help another person cope with their own suffering by introducing them to these ideas. So that's one approach. Another approach is that, it's a little modification of the first, is that it depends when a person is being chastised. It depends who does it. if someone that doesn't care for you throws an insult at you and tells you something about yourself that you don't like, that happens to be true, you will resent that person. You will be offended and you will resent it. But if someone who truly loves you in a loving and caring way points out your deficiency, it may not be music to your ears, at least to some people, but you will appreciate it, and it'll only, in the long run, enhance your appreciation for that person's concern for you, recognizing that it was done out of love. When a father chastises a child, sometimes the child resents it, but I don't know any kid, unless the parents were really abusive, and which happens unfortunately, but every child, I think, relishes the times that their parents, out of concern and love for them, took them to task. No one everyone would give all the money in the world to be able to be reprimanded by their parents that are not here anymore. You feel that it's done out of love. There's a story told of the Gerer Rebbe, known as the Sfas Emes, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, who inherited the leadership of his movement from his grandfather, because his father predeceased his grandfather. So his grandfather more or less was his teacher and parent, and raised him until he became Rebbe himself, I think at the age of 18. So once he was up all night long with a friend of his studying Talmud, all night. And in the early hours of the morning, he put his head down to sleep for an hour or two. So he came a few minutes late to class the next morning. And his grandfather chastised him and said to him, "How could you ever amount to anything? If you come late, that shows you're lazy." And he really, really gave it to him. And in front of his friend, and his friend was like almost like elbowing him. "Why didn't you tell him we were up all night studying? We're much better than just getting there in time. We were studying all night." But he said nothing. He just accepted it with equanimity. After the grandfather finished scolding him, his friend said to him, "Why didn't you tell him that we were up all night learning?" He says, "And miss the words of rebuke from my grandfather?" Every word of it was music to my ears. I relished every bit of it. It was so meaningful to me. It was so beautiful. I wanted to hear more and more, because to him those were words of love. So that's another approach when a person suffers and they know that who is cleansing them? It's God who's doing it. God does it out of love. He doesn't do it out of hatred. He's not doing it because he wants to harm you. He wants to do it because he wants you to be cleansed. So that's a meditation that can help change a person's attitude. But here the Alter Rebbe goes deeper. Because the other approach is that really suffering is bad. But it has a good outcome. It'll cleanse you. So it's like a person has to do strenuous exercise. It's painful. Your joints are hurting. You don't really enjoy it. Well, some people I think do, actually. They're masochists, I think, if they do. When I look at the equipment in gyms, I say that's what they used in 1492, the Inquisition, with all the torture machines, and how people pay for it. But people do it. Why? Because there's a good outcome. It's good for your health. So here also, pain and suffering is negative, inherently painful and negative, but it leads to a positive outcome. What we're going to learn here, chapter 26, is an approach that looks at the suffering in a totally different light, which we'll get to in a moment. So in order to understand this, he prefaces Mudar Zos. It's well known, L'Kol, to everyone. Everyone knows this. In those days, I think it was a fair statement that anyone who studied the Tanya knew this. Maimer Razal, the saying of our sages, Kishem shemevarech al hatova chulu. Just like you bless God for good, so must a person also recite a blessing for misfortune. Now, what does that mean? We don't say the same blessing. When something good happens to you, certain types of good, you say the blessing Hatov v'hameitiv, God who is good and does good. Sometimes you make a bracha shechayanu, thanking God for living to this event. If God forbid someone suffers a tragedy, the blessing that you hear in a funeral home is a totally different blessing. It's dayan ha'emes. God is the true judge. You're accepting God's judgment, even though you don't like it and it's painful, but you accept the fact that God is the judge and He knows what He's doing, and we can't argue with Him. So it's a totally different blessing. So what does the Mishnah mean? It's in the Mishnah that you should bless God for the misfortune the same way you bless Him for the good. It's not the same blessing. So the Talmud explains that. Upirshu b'Gemara, the Talmud explains. See, the Talmud is broken up into Mishnah, which is the earlier collection of teachings of the earlier sages, and then the Gemara, which elucidates the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says you should, the same way you bless God for the good, that's how you bless Him for the bad. And the Gemara explains what it means. What it means is likibule besimcha. You should accept it with joy. Kmo simchas hatova haniglis v'haniris. Just like you accept the good that is revealed and visible and obvious good. In the Talmud, there's a version that has the word mamash, literally. The Alter Rebbe deletes that word for a very simple reason. No matter what, you cannot accept the suffering the same way you accept the good. That's not tenable. That's not tenable. Now, the Talmud tells a story, two stories, that are also very much become very widely publicized. Rabbi Akiva, well, let's start the next word. Kigam zu litova. For it too is for the good. Rak she'ena niglis v'niris la'eni basar. It's not apparent and visible to mortal eyes. I'll stop there for a moment. The words Kigam zu litova is a Talmudic phrase coined by Rabbi Akiva, by Nachum Ish Gamzu. Nachum was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. But there are two stories, parallel stories. Rabbi Akiva's story I'll tell first. And he was once traveling with his donkey, his rooster to wake him up in the morning. It was his alarm clock and a candle. Okay, and he looked for some lodging in the town, and no one was nice enough to let him in. So he had to sleep in the forest. A lion came along and devoured the donkey. A wolf or a fox came along and ate up the rooster. The wind extinguished the flame. So he was left without anything. And every time a misfortune occurred, they didn't let him in the house. Gamzu Latova, this is also for the good. He had no idea what the good would be, but he knew it was for the good. What?
Rabbi Akiva said Gamzu Latova?
I'm sorry, he said, Kol ma'at avid Rahman Latav avid. Thank you. It was in Aramaic. He said, whatever God does is for the good. It sounds the same thing, but it's actually a little different. The story with...
Is it for the good or it is good?
No, it's for the good. Litav of it. It's for the good. He did it. He knew that something good was going to come out of it. Mm-hmm. He didn't know what it was. And what happened in the end? There were a bunch of marauders who came into town, took everyone prisoner, robbed the whole town. Who knows how many people they might have killed. Had Rabbi Akiva's donkey, rooster, and candle not been eliminated, they would have detected his presence and he would have been taken captive. Who knows what could have happened. So it literally saved his life. We find similar things happening even today, where people see how the bad actually turns into good very, very soon. Someone misses a flight, and that was the flight that went into the Twin Towers and other tragedies that happened. There were so many stories like that, where people were so upset they couldn't get on the plane, and that saved their life. A person comes to an interview for a job and is turned down for the job or loses a job, and they're so upset. A week later, they get a job that pays 3 times as much better conditions. Had they accepted the job, they would have never gotten this better job. So people see very often how the negative turns into positive. But the negative is not positive in that case, because it's still painful to be fired. It's still painful to be late for an important meeting. It's just that there's a greater good that comes out of the negative. Yes?
But not for the people that were in the Twin
No. We're talking about the individual who missed the flight. For that particular person, there's a story. Usually the stories are the opposite, where the Rebbe told certain people, Sharon, not to take a flight he was supposed to take, and that flight was hijacked. But I know of a case where one of the senior rabbis in Crown Heights, his wife was going on a trip, and I think she asked the Rebbe about a flight, and he said not to take that flight, to take the next flight. The next flight had mechanical problems, and it almost crashed, and everyone came out unscathed. So she asked the Rebbe, why did you send me to that flight? And the Rebbe said, why does it trouble you that because of you the whole flight was saved? So the Rebbe sent her into the flight that had the accident to save everyone there. But anyhow, that's just incidental. So sometimes we see what good comes for us from the negative. The story of Nachum Ish Gamzu is a stronger story. What happened there? The Romans were always causing trouble for the Jews. This is right after the destruction of the temple, or right before it. And they decided to send Nachum, who was known as a very holy person, to give a box full of jewels and gold and silver to the emperor in Rome, to bribe him, in a sense, to soften his terrible decrees against the Jews in Israel. And he comes to this inn on the way, and the owner of the inn was unscrupulous, and he found out that it was a box full of diamonds, so he emptied the box and fills it up with sand from his backyard.
But wait.
What?
To give it some weight.
To give it some weight. And when Nachum on the way discovers it, he wasn't in trouble. He said, Gam zu l'tova. This is also good. This is also good. He didn't mean it's going to be good in the end. It is good. It's positive. And then when they got to the emperor and they opened up the box and they saw sand, the emperor got so angry he threw him in a dungeon. The chutzpah, the Jews are mocking me. Then one of the officers, who was really Elijah the prophet, who was disguised as an officer, said, you think the Jews are stupid? We know we don't like them, but they're not stupid. Why would they bring you a box full of sand? This sand must have miraculous powers. It might turn into weapons. Use it against your enemies in a battle. And indeed, the sand turned into arrows and spears, and he won the battle. And Nachum got what he wanted from the emperor. In addition, the emperor filled up a box full of diamonds and gold to bring back to the Jews. And so he fills up his boxes full of sand. And of course, his sand was worthless, and he was disposed of by the emperor. But anyhow, what Nachum, what he did in every step of the way, he realized that not only was something good going to come out of it, but it was better that if they had the diamonds, maybe they would have gotten the emperor to soften him a little, but maybe not. Here, the emperor was softened, and they were rewarded for it. It was worth more than the diamonds. It was better than it was before. At any rate, we have these famous stories, and there's the famous story of Rabbi Zusha. Rabbi Zusha was a student of the Maggid of Mizrich, an older colleague of the Alter Rebbe, and he lived in the same town as the Mizrich Maggid in the city of Anipoli. The Mizrich Maggid was from Mizrich, but he moved to Anipoli later in his life. And a man comes to the Maggid, who's the senior rabbi, master, and he says to him, quoting this passage in the Talmud, he says, I don't understand it. I don't understand how it's possible for someone to accept misfortune with joy. And the Maggid says, well, go to my disciple, Zusha, he'll explain it to you. And he comes to Zusha's hut, and everyone who heard the story knows that it was, every time you hear the story, the hut becomes less and less, but more and more furnishings are removed from it every time the story is told. It was a bare bones, it didn't have any furniture, it had some rocks and some planks of wood. The kids were in tatters. emaciated. They hadn't anything to eat. They had no clothing, no to speak of. It was like the most pitiful place you could imagine. And he knocks on the door, and he sees a man comes to the door with a big smile on his face. "What can I do for you?" "I'm coming from the Rebbe." "Oh, what a great honor. What for?" The Rebbe said, "I should ask you the question." And he asked him the question. He says, "Why did he send you to me? I can't answer this. I never experienced anything bad in my life. I don't know how you accept the misfortune with joy when I never had misfortune." Obviously, Reb Zusha was on a very, very high level. And how could we expect that the average person should come close to Rabbi Akiva, Nachum Ish Gamzu, or Reb Zusha? This is like so much out of our league. It's so unreasonable. It's so unrealistic. Yes, there are people who are on that level. So how could we possibly reach that level?
Does the Alter Rebbe say that we could attain to Rabbi Akiva's level, which is to believe that everything is for the good, or that does the Alter Rebbe say that we can even attain to the level of Reb Nachum to believe that everything is
Yes, that's what he's going to explain here in this chapter. He's going to show that the suffering is positive. So this is very, very challenging. And Rabbi Jacobson told a story, and I heard the story many times. The story that has a name attached to it. Rabbi Berish Meislish was a very prominent Rosh Yeshiva. He headed a whole academy, but he also was a businessman. He owned a major lumber company. He would import lumber from Russia, from the forests of Russia, and they would distribute it to the entire area in Central and Western Europe. And he made tons of money, very wealthy man, and he had to do very little. He just probably made a few inquiries and did a few small things, and the rest of the year he was able to teach his students and serve as a rabbi. And one year, the entire shipment of lumber that was sent from Russia, which meant that he invested his entire fortune in that shipment and borrowed money also, because this was going to be the most profitable venture of all of it, the boats capsized and all the lumber was lost. And the man now was penniless and in huge debt. And the letter arrived to his community, to his family, and they didn't know how they were going to tell him about the terrible loss. This man was turned from one of the wealthiest people around to a pauper who's in millions of dollars of debt. So they decided to ask one of his students, who was very close to him, to be the one to find a way to softly divulge the terrible news. So the student comes to him and says, "I have a question to ask you on the Talmud. It says you should accept misfortune the same way you accept joy, a happy event. How is that possible?" And the rabbi goes into a lengthy discussion about how God is good and God is the source of everything, and if God does it, we have to accept it as good. He goes on, and the student says, "I still can't understand it." I said, well, let's imagine you're a very wealthy man. You have these huge lumber company. What would happen if, God forbid, all of your lumber would be a major loss, and you would be penniless and you'd be in big debt? Would you say the same thing? He says, absolutely. God doesn't change just because it's me. It's you have to accept it with joy. He says, well, if someone experienced that, he'd have to accept it with joy, yes? Would it be okay for him to dance with joy? Rabbi says, yeah, obviously. If he's happy, you dance. Start dancing, Rabbi.
The guy fainted.
And the rabbi fainted. And when they revived him, he says, apparently I don't understand the Talmud either. Whether it's a true story or not, it's a very true story. It's very easy to philosophize about how you could accept suffering, but in the real world, it's not so simple. So what is the point of...
And also, Nachum Ish Gamzu and Rabbi Akiva were pretty lucky that in their lifetime they got to see how it was for the good, but not all of us see.
They got to see it
for the good in our
almost, relatively speaking, almost immediately. Mm-hmm. they saw the benefit right away. And sometimes we do see the benefit. Sometimes we see it within a few days. Sometimes. That's why I said
My
sometimes.
daughter a few days ago was excluded. Her two closest friends went out on outing, and she asked to be included, and they very nicely excluded her, and she was extremely hurt. But then, just shortly afterwards, she found out that they were planning a surprise birthday party for her, and they were going shopping to prepare for her surprise. So she was lucky enough to see the good in that, and everything ended really well. But life is not always so dandy.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially when people get sick.
Or another example of this, a lecturer was talking about all the theories of how there's evil in this world and pain and suffering, and how Jewish philosophy and deals with it and everything. In our lecture, and a young woman raises her hand and says, "Can I ask you a question?" Sure. He said, did you ever give this lecture? Did you ever visit the children's ward in a hospital? Children with terminal diseases are? And he said, no. He says, well, that's where you should give this lecture, not to us. It's very easy to give this lecture to people who haven't suffered. It's very easy for them to understand, oh yeah, I understand suffering. But people who really go through true suffering, how could you give this lecture?
So,
Especially, yeah.
To bring it down, what do you do when you know people who have something like Alzheimer's? And there's only one way that goes.
Yeah.
And it's long.
Yeah, there's nothing, in terms of explaining to them, they're not capable.
Well, even just for their
Family,
how do you make
she's
it better?
saying.
The family.
family.
How do you make it better?
No, you do whatever you can do to make their lives more comfortable. But in order to understand someone who is suffering, the person with the Alzheimer's, whether or not they're suffering, depends on what stage they're in.
The family suffers.
But usually there's nothing that they don't have the mental capacity to understand
The
anything.
family.
But the family, so how do you deal with a family? And that's true about any situation. And it's a little bit chutzpahdik for people who grow up in America in relative comfort and affluence to somehow try to explain away the suffering of Jews in the Holocaust or in other terrible situations. It seems so difficult. I remember Gerda Klein. I'm sure you heard of Gerda Klein. We once invited her to give a talk at UB when I was working at UB. And her talk was, let's say, scheduled for 7 p.m. It's 7. She's not here. About 7:15, she walks in, and she starts her talk. And I don't remember anything else she said except for her introduction. Her introduction was like this: I'm sorry for being late. I was looking for a parking space, and I couldn't find one. It took me 15 minutes to find a parking space. And I was getting upset that I'm late for this lecture. And then it dawned on me that when I was in the camps, in my wildest of dreams, I could not have imagined that 30 years hence, my biggest problem would be that I couldn't find a parking space on my way to a lecture in a university. And she said once she thought of it that way, all of her anxiety disappeared.
I heard her say something similar when she was all dressed up to give a speech, and she had just come from her grandchildren, and they had dribbled on her and clothed her, and she was upset, and then she said something similar.
Yeah, it puts things into perspective. So how do we?
But based on that, because I remember I once told my son Will that when he was catching about something, and I said to him, "Do you know that there are many people in the world that have much less?" So he said, "Does that mean that I never have a right to complain because my floor is always someone else's roof?" That was his expression. So basically, she's comparing it to her own life, but there's always someone that's less fortunate than us. Does that mean that we're never entitled to experience disappointment or feeling upset?
Yes, but do you want to stay that way?
No, so obviously you can't.
If you want to stay that way, then that's the way to look. Always
Right.
look at
You
someone
can't
who
expend, you
who has
can't
more than you.
delve on it, but
No, but we're trying to treat sadness and anxiety, not trying to justify it and perpetuate it, because that's the choices we have. We can be bitter, which is what happened with many Jews after the Holocaust, and you can't blame them for being bitter. No one has a right to judge them, but wouldn't it be better if they found a way of not being bitter? Wouldn't they be better off and would have lived a much happier life? There's one Holocaust survivor I remember, he's no longer here, who never got married and was always very bitter and angry and cynical because he saw through his hiding place how the Germans were machine gunning children, and that so disturbed him that he could never lead a normal life. Now, if someone would have come along, a therapist, a rabbi, and would have somehow been able to get through to him to not feel that way, wouldn't that have been better? We're not judging him, but we're still, we want to help a person who is in this state, who feels this bitterness and this sadness and this anxiety, to get out of it. So it depends how we approach this. If we're approaching this as we understand suffering and pain, and we can put it into perspective, and we're fine with it, that's callous, and it won't work. The Alter Rebbe, number one, he himself had a very difficult life. Besides losing a young daughter who was probably in her 20s, does anyone know how old she was, Leah? She was very young, and losing a daughter, besides the fact that he was persecuted by his own brethren, they put him in prison, almost sentenced to death. He was attacked. He was, and at the end of his life, he was fleeing from Napoleon's armies, and he lived a very difficult life. So he knew what suffering and pain was. So in that sense, he was a little bit more qualified, or a lot more qualified. Another thing is that the Alter Rebbe was a holy man, and his soul was so strong that he felt his connection to everyone. So he wasn't talking about someone else. Oh, I can make you feel good. He was talking about himself. This was a personal thing. This is it's one body. So what about, and also it was offered as a loving mentor, not someone who's a lecturer, a philosopher, but someone who cares, who's empathetic and filled with love. So if you tell a person, if we learn this not just as a intellectual exercise, and we deliver it to others in a loving way, it's not necessarily going to take away their pain immediately. It's something that requires learning and relearning and meditating on. And the main point is it needs a paradigm shift. And that's something that's becoming very popular these days. That how do people deal with adversity is by changing the way you think about everything. And people are capable of doing that. So this is, the Alter Rebbe is going to do to us, is going to give us a paradigm shift. And if it works instantaneously, you probably didn't understand what he was saying. Because it's not humanly possible for someone to change in an instant. But it gives you, at least in your mind, it gives you the ability to understand, have the material to understand how you could relate to the suffering and pain. And then with the passage of time, you could use it. And I'll tell you a story this is a true story, for sure. The Rebbe's grandfather, the Rebbe's mother's father, was a Rabbi Yanovsky, was his name. He was the rabbi of the city of Nikolaev in Russia. And he contracted typhus. And most people died from typhus in those days. So they quarantined them in a hospital outside the city. And nobody was allowed in there. Only the doctor would come in and prescribe whatever pain medication. And virtually everyone died. Very few people survived it. And the Rebbe's grandfather, this is before the Rebbe was even born, was sick with typhus, and he was in that hospital. A friend of his, whose name was Usher Grossman, of the city of Nikolaev, he was a shaykhut, a very respected man, tried to visit him, and they wouldn't let him in. So he figured out, to the best of his ability, which room he was in, and he went over to the window. They let him outside, and he read, not this chapter, but another chapter in Tanya, which has a similar theme, about how God, everything is with God's will, and so on and so forth. And he just read it loud as he could, hoping that that was the right room, and that the window, the sound was able to penetrate, and that he was able to hear the words. And he repeated this every day. He came there every day and recited the same chapter for a few weeks, and he came out alive. And he told him, later on, a few years later, there was an event that he was invited to come, and he refused to eat at the rabbi's house. He was very strict, so he wouldn't eat. And the rabbi says, you deserve to be reprimanded, but how could I reprimand you? You saved my life. How did he save his life? Just by reading it over and over and over. I'm sure it didn't work the first day. The man was dying. But the reading over and over finally penetrated until it changed his whole attitude, and that gave him the strength to overcome the illness. So let's see. Let's see how the Alter Rebbe deals with it. So we'll continue that sentence that we started. That everything is good, but it's not revealed good. Ki hu mi alma diskasya. It comes from the hidden world. Sholomayla mi alma disgalya, which is higher than the revealed world. There are two dimensions of existence. There's what is called the hidden world, and there's the revealed world. And if we take God's name, which consists of 4 letters, the first 2 letters correspond to the hidden world, and the second 2 letters correspond to the revealed world. Shehu Vav K. We don't pronounce the letter the way it should be. It's separated from the Vav. Page 347. Hu Vav K Mishem Havaya Baruch Hu. It's the Vav and the Hey of God's name, which is called Havaya. That's the way we refer to the Tetragrammaton. Blessed is He. The Alma Diskasya Hu Yud K, whereas the hidden world is the Yud and the Hey of God's name. What does that mean? When we talk about God, God relates to the universe, to existence, in 2 ways. The higher dimensions are more or less submerged in the divine. They, just like a fish, lives and thrives in the water and is nurtured from the water and can't separate from it. That's a hidden dimension. That's a dimension where God is distant, He's aloof, and not in a mode of connecting to us, because He's beyond us. And that relates to the letters Yud and a Hey. The Yud and the Hey of God's name correspond to God's intellectual faculties, as opposed to the Vav and the Hey, which refer to God's emotional faculties. What's the difference between intellect and emotion? When you're in an intellectual mode, you're not in a relationship. You can't speculate in your mind. You can't think clearly if you're socializing. If you're socializing, you're not in the mode of being in an intellectual setting. Using your mind means that you're withdrawing into yourself to think of something that is above you and trying to absorb it. While you're absorbing, you can't relate to something on the outside. Emotions, on the other hand, are totally relationships oriented. when your emotions deal with how you relate to the outside. So when we talk about the hidden worlds, those are the worlds that are hidden from us. They're way beyond us. We can't understand them. Whereas the Vav and the Hey of God's name relate to the worlds that God has a relationship with. We could comprehend, we can have some concept and some appreciation for God. So, yes.
So, when you're not in a relationship, I'm thinking of the book of Esther where God is hidden, right?
Yes.
So does this relate to it at all?
Yes, it
the
does.
Intellectual relationship?
Absolutely.
So
When God is in a state of aloofness, that's when we feel abandoned and we feel the suffering and the pain. And we don't understand where it's coming from. But what he's saying over here is that the suffering and the pain comes from that aspect of God that is beyond us. It's a higher aspect of God than the part of God or the aspect of God that relates to us in a normal situation. The more painful something is, that is an indication that we're connecting to an aspect of God that is truly beyond us and on a much higher level. And as he'll soon explain, that a person who doesn't mind suffering, who can absorb the suffering, it's because he cares more about his relationship with God, an intimate relationship, than he cares about anything else. So he's able to accept and the suffering, and it doesn't disturb him. In other words, to use a simple down-to-earth analogy, if something is disturbing you, something is, bothers you, you had a problem at work, and you come home and you're told that you won the $1 million lottery, is it going to bother you anymore? No. Yeah, okay, that's minor. You got such a great gift and something out of the ordinary that anything negative pales in significance in comparison, that you're not bothered by it. So the person who accepts suffering is someone who's able to appreciate that suffering comes from a much higher level, a concealed level. Because it's so high, it can't come out in a positive way. It comes out in a negative way. The analogy is given, a teacher, a devoted teacher who's teaching his students, and he's giving them good explanations and teaching them on their level. And then the teacher decides one day, you know what, enough is enough. Enough of catering to their limits. I'm going to take them to a higher level. And he starts to teach them on a much higher level. And the students say, we don't understand the word he said.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some students will say, you know what, he used to be a great teacher. He's not anymore. I'm quitting this class. The smart students will say, the teacher's trying to bring us to a higher level. And I love this teacher. I want to be close to him. I appreciate this higher level, even though I don't understand it yet, but I appreciate it, and I prefer that to being on a mediocre level, having a very limited relationship in terms of the knowledge, where it feels more comfortable. I'm willing to sacrifice that for something much higher, a much deeper, a much more profound intellectual relationship. That's the metaphor of an intellectual relationship. And it's true also with deeper, other types of relationships, that if you really love the person, you're willing to sacrifice some comfort for having a much higher level relationship. And that's what the suffering is. The suffering is reconnecting to a God that you can't understand because he comes from a world of concealment. But you're willing to endure the suffering if it means that you are going to be closer to God without any levels that separate between you and God, or make the relationship less pronounced and less emphatic and less intense.
So how does that relate to Esther?
whenever God is hidden, we have to recognize that it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. It means that God is saying to us, I want now to relate to you on a deeper level. And instead of looking at it as abandonment, we look at it as we embrace it. We embrace it and say, God, we understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to connect us to something higher. We're going to follow you. As opposed to the person who says, because of the suffering, it means you don't like us anymore. You're withdrawing from us, so we'll go someplace else. Again, that's the same choice we have in every event in life. We can take an event and say, God wasn't nice to me today. You know what? I'm not going to be nice to him today. It's quid pro quo. That's one approach. The other approach is, God, I know what you're doing over here. You're not just testing me. It's a test. It can be a test as well, but it's deeper than that. It's not God just testing us. What God is saying, I'm now going to introduce you to a deeper level, but because it's so deep, you won't understand it. If you accept it, a time will come when you will understand it, and you will thank me for it. It says in the Torah, it says that when Mashiach comes, we will say to God, Odcha Hashem, thank you, God, ki onafta bi, that you vented your wrath against me. Thank you for venting wrath? Yes. Now we don't understand it. We just could believe in it. In the Messianic age, we will understand it. We will then appreciate it. Again, this doesn't mean that the person should say, God, if pain and suffering is a sign that you're closer to me and you want to give me much more, so God, please give me and all my friends a lot of pain and suffering. That's contrary to Judaism. You're not allowed to do that. God has to decide when he's ready to change the level of the relationship. And if Mashiach comes, you don't need that anymore. So that's why we pray for Mashiach. Not just because things will be better, but we won't need the pain and the suffering to enjoy this higher level relationship. We will have our cake and eat it. That's the benefit.
So Esther understood that.
Anytime there's hidden, they tell the story, again, it's apocryphal story, but during the Inquisition, I heard that one version of it, a man was running away from Spain, and on the way he lost his wealth, then he lost his family, and every time he was having another major blow, he was saying to God, God, I know what you're trying to do to me, but no matter what you'll do, I'll still love you. That's the story they tell. Whether it was true or not, I don't know. There's also a fictional story about a Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto who wrote something to that effect and left it in a bottle or something. That was a fictional story, but it may be fictional in that particular instance, but these are things that happen throughout history. Jews who were subjected to the worst type of pain and persecution not only didn't give up their faith, but it strengthened their faith. And I know Holocaust survivors. Mr. Sam Friedman is one of them. I don't know if you knew him. He was a stockbroker. You know the Blitzers? You heard of them? You know Wolf Blitzer. This is Wolf's uncle.
Right.
Mr. Friedman's wife and Wolf's mother were sisters. So Sam Friedman, he told me that the Holocaust strengthened his faith in God. So there are people who lost their faith, people who didn't lose their faith, and some people who got more faith.
Well,
Right?
Gershon Wachtel, when his son drowned, he said that it's from Toronto. It's Murray Shapiro's.
He was a pianist, a very talented pianist.
Murray Shapiro and Buffalo's brother-in-law, her sister, and brother.
With Gershon Hotel, didn't he come in and play Kadima?
Yes.
Yeah.
So tell me again what happened.
So
He
his
lost
son,
a child.
he lost a child who drowned.
Oh my gosh!
And-
How did that happen?
The kid was about 6 years old, maybe.
No,
Was
that's
that before or after he came to?
Oh yeah, way
Kadima?
before.
Oh, way
He
before.
spoke about it at Kadima.
Yes, so he
Okay.
said
Yeah.
after that he feels that he belongs to an elite club. That him and others that have gone through this experience are now almost, it was an expensive ticket to pay. That's the way he says. It's a very high price to belong to this elite club, but he feels
And that nobody should ever want to be part of that club. It's not.
But he experiences a special depth and connection to God that he says that, people that are not club members cannot experience.
Yeah, he is a transformed person. I can see that in many ways.
In that way,
in my teaching of the Holocaust at UB, probably over 20 years worth, 25 years, I have probably at least 200 interviews with Holocaust survivors that the students had to conduct, in which they were told the assignment was to survey the faith and Jewish life of the survivors before, during, and after the Holocaust. And I expected that out of 200, at least 150 would say they lost their faith. And I would have totally understood it. And I would have, of course, marveled at the other 50. I was shocked, pleasantly, to discover that of the 200, there were maybe 2 people who said that they lost their faith, and that's it. Almost everyone else, like 99%, 98%, I don't remember the exact numbers, said that they either never lost their faith grew, small number, or they lost it and they got it back. Some didn't get it back with total observance the way they used to be before the war, but most of them still felt strongly Jewish and had a relationship with God and with Judaism even after the Holocaust. So it's an incredible thing that these people were able to do that. Had they known more about Torah and they would have heard more about these concepts, I'm sure it could have contributed to their recovery and their emotional and spiritual rehabilitation. And Vizel, just go another line. Vizel Shakosov, and this is the meaning of what is written of the verse in Psalms. Ashrei Hagever Asher Tiesrenu Yudke Vigomer. Happy is the man whom you, God, chastises. Now the Hebrew word for God is the Yud and the Hey. That's it. We just indicated that the Yud and the Hey represents the hidden, the inscrutable aspects of God that we cannot comprehend, that are beyond us. The person who is afflicted has a relationship with that level of God. And with that level of God that you relate to, you are on a higher level than the person who isn't afflicted. So a person who recognizes this and internalizes it, and it requires strong faith that everything that God does must be good. It's impossible that God should do anything that is bad. That doesn't mean we can't complain to God, because that is part of God's goodness, that He wants us to complain when it comes to the suffering of others. We're supposed to, so there's a paradox over here that we're constantly going to be addressing. On one hand, we say to God, God, you did this, you owe us something. Because God wants us to be demanding of more good in this world, more visible good. But when there was negative experience, negative feelings, suffering, and pain in the past, God wants us to see it in a totally different manner, a total paradigm shift. And I will conclude with a story that I actually used. That there was a chassid, I forgot who it was, but a very, very great man, very spiritual person who was going through the worst type of suffering, physical pain. And he would groan like people in pain do. He would go, "Ay." And then he would remember this chapter of Tanya, that he's now connected to God's hidden dimension, and that shows a certain closeness that you have to God beyond the norm. And he would say, "Ah." And then he would groan again, "Ay, ah." So I remember that when I had gallbladder attack, and it was the worst pain that I've ever felt in my life, and it was persistent, and there's nothing I can compare it to. So there's nothing I can do. I couldn't take no medication worked. Even when I was in the hospital all night, they refused to give me any painkillers because they said it would mask the pain. Finally, they gave me morphine, and it didn't work. They had to give me another heavy dose of morphine before it worked. But the only thing I was able to do was remind myself of the story, and I would say, "Oi, ah." So at least it distracted me for a few seconds, so it did work a little bit. But that's what this chapter is trying to help us with the after the I.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll continue with the show next week.
Next week I have a conflict.
Okay?
So you'll
It's going to be online.
I'll watch it. What's the topic next week?
It's continuation of this.
This whole chapter
Yeah.
is all
Oh, okay.
And then it's going to get to spiritual problems. Cause,
Do you read, you see Hurwitz's blog?
no, I don't get it. No.
His
I know.
he uses his eyes.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I know. He was here years ago. Very sweet, the sweetest person you could know.
He's so full of light and
Yeah.
love. And
Stop broadcast. I don't know. I think it
it's
stopped.
just unbelievable. He's a very advanced ALS.
Did he tell you what to do?
He's on a
He told me, but I don't know. He said to push that twice. I did
He
it.
uses a computer.
Stop
with
broadcast,
the
yes.
Chassis to write.
How young is it?
He's in his
younger than
30s.
sure.
He's in his
He's
30s.
maybe
Late 30s?
Oh, it's horrible. And where does he work?
he was
in Los
actually up
Angeles.
in
In
a city in California.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
What's
Los
with
Angeles.
ALS? I mean, I know just so many people who
I know.
have it, and so many people.
But
who
this
get
man is so full of joy and love.
He's unbelievable.
He was a singer, and he would play. I mean, his whole